So welcome, thanks for joining. I think all of us here were at our workshop last year, so we won't spend a lot of time on intros. You've met me, Julian, we've got JP, and we've got Philippa. We indicated last year that following the workshop, we were going to do a further round of consultation on the guidance for the retail price consistency assessment. We also said that there'd been pretty consistent feedback around, consistent but for different reasons, feedback around uncommitted capacity, and that we would give some more thought to that. We therefore thought it was useful to do another round of consultation on that point, and we included another couple of matters in the consultation as well. So what we wanted to do today was just to provide an opportunity for clarification questions as you kind of read this and think about what you might want to submit on. We weren't going to do any kind of presentation. We're going to take the paper as read. So it really was just an opportunity for questions. So I'll hand over to JP on the RPCA, and then we'll go to the uncommitted capacity and other matters. So over to you.
Well, we should just let everyone know that we are recording the session. You will have seen that when we started, and we will make a copy of the recording available afterwards as well. And I think all of your actual voice stuff is disabled, so please put your questions into the Q&A box and we'll read them out and go around like that.
Cool.
Okay, I'll then do a quick intro on the draft guidance for the retail price consistency assessment. So the draft guidance benefited obviously from the submissions to our October paper and on what we heard at the December 9 workshop a couple of months ago. In drafting that guidance, we've sought to balance different interests or criteria or considerations, including transparency, the ability for to preserve some flexibility so that Gentailer can reflect its circumstances and preferences in constructing an SF portfolio versus an alternative of more prescription, and then the concept of minimizing compliance and administrative costs. So I think you see that balancing of different interests show up in our explanations of how we thought about different approaches and the ultimate choices that we put forward on the draft guidance, for example, on the level of prescription, on the hedge portfolio construction, on how to think about costs, the cost standard to be used, segmentation, and also how to interpret the RPCA results, particularly those with negative margins. So I'll leave it there and just open up with that introductory comment to hear any of your clarifying questions to help you with your submissions.
Just add that I hope, not being a Teams expert, I think I've enabled mics and cameras for everyone because it seems more useful to have a conversation if we can. So have a crack at that if you want to ask a question. Much rather hear it asked rather than typed. So have a go at that first if you've got questions. And I think I've turned your cameras on as well if you need to have them on.
Hey, I'm Rob Allen here. Everyone else seems to be a bit shy.
Thanks,
so
Rob.
I'll start. You talk about it's up to the gentailer how they allocate costs and all that kind of stuff, but you say that they would be expected to use a quote unquote principled cost allocation rule. Would I be correct then in saying, there's lots of different principled cost allocation rules, so that would permit a standard fully allocated cost methodology, and it would also facilitate an avoidable cost allocation methodology if the gentailer chose?
So we describe in the guidance how we think about cost allocation. It should include an appropriate attribution of shared and common costs to the costs, retail costs, for example. So we've got that described. Precisely how that ought to be done, we leave open at this stage. We're interested in seeing, well, that's the proposal. We would be interested in seeing the approaches taken by gentailers, and they've got, we would be asking them to disclose that in their methodologies and so forth that we would get and are able to check and peruse. Yeah, I think that's all to say on that at this point, Rob.
I'm not quite sure if I understood the answer to the questions. So is that both of those methodologies would be permitted because they're principle based, or would either or one of them be excluded?
So as long as it's consistent with the as sufficient competitor test or methodology approach, then we are open to seeing what comes through in terms of methodologies, as long as the cost drivers used are principled and make sense, and there's an appropriate attribution of costs to the different parts of the business.
Okay, I'm very confused now.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what the answer to my question was.
I think just to add one thing, so it's got to align with the principle set out in terms of the as efficient competitor. So any cost allocation methodology that wasn't aligned to that outcome would seem to be a problem. I think the other element of it as well is there are opportunities to change this over time. I think what we didn't want to have is, once you start getting into a great deal of prescription around this, you spend a lot of time debating cost allocation methodologies. Not sure whether that helps or not, but
no, not really. But it seems quite fundamental. To be clear, an avoidable cost allocation methodology wouldn't allocate costs that were common to a number of different services. So I would have thought it'd be pretty black and white for you to be able to answer yes, that would be acceptable, or no, it wouldn't be acceptable to use a methodology that wouldn't allocate any common costs.
Okay, well, Rob,
I'm not quite sure. I'm just not quite sure about why there's a lack of clarity here in the answer. Or to me, it appears there's a lack of clarity in the answer.
Okay, Rob. Well, please submit on that. I think that the document is clear that we're expecting an as sufficient competitor standard, and that would include, which may be a slight variation on the pure approach to that would include an attribution of common and shared costs to cost allocation. So that's pretty clearly stated in both the front end of the document as well as in the actual guidance. Hope that answers that question for now, but of course happy to further engage on that through submissions and so forth.
I've probably done this to death now, but I got confused by the consultation paper and the guidelines as well. I'll leave it at that.
If there are particular methodologies that you think would be unacceptable, please also let us know what you think those are and why. And we may be more prescriptive in the guidance.
Eleanor? You got a question, Eleanor? Just check that your mic should be working.
It's Nick. So Nick Haynes from Electric Kiwi here. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
All right, well, I'll just jump the queue then in front of Eleanor while she sorts out her mic. Thanks to the team. I've just got a question in relation to A.36 within the paper, specifically the exclusion of larger commercial and industrial consumers from the RPCA. Just interested to hear any commentary from the team as to why they felt exclusion of that subset of the retail market was appropriate.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Again, we have described it in a couple of places, but fundamentally the focus is on the mass market part of the market, and including because we think there's different contractual arrangements between retailers and those commercial and industrial customers that doesn't lend itself to an RPCA type analysis.
Okay, that's interesting, and I appreciate it may be something that we need to submit on, but I just encourage the team to consider that anything above sort of mass market is quite a broad range. So whilst there could be some arguments for the TY end of the spectrum to have some sort of specific considerations, there's a huge number of CNI consumers in New Zealand, and some of the same challenges that residential and mass market are facing are faced by that sector as well.
Yeah, so by all means, we'd be interested in hearing about that. Including practical ways of thresholds or ways to separate out different groups within that CNI bucket.
Thank you.
Eleanor, I had another go at enabling your mic and camera, so if you want to try again, please go for it.
Hi, I'm on Nick's one now. Is that working now?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Luckily we're sitting next to each other, so that's good. My question was actually related to Rob's point around, what methodology for the retail costs and the common costs. I just noted that it's quite a small part of the actual code write-up around retail operating costs, including a contribution of gentailers' shared and common costs. I presume the EA will therefore be getting details of how that cost has been made up, because I know from reviewing everyone's financial statements that everyone's methodology of where they put costs between common, wholesale and retail all differs. So I presume, you'll be wanting you might need a bit more detail in there about actually the information that you're wanting there, because you'll probably get a range of uninterpretable answers, would be my guidance on that number, just because how different it varies between retail.
Yeah, thanks for that. And of course, we also continue to have the option to go back to those making to gentailers to ask questions to clarify if needed. And so, yeah, part of this process will also be learning about what works, what doesn't work, what will justify more guidance to help us, the authority, or to help gentailers to submit good quality RPCAs and methodologies, and for people to interpret results more generally.
Thank you. Do you mind if I steal the time for another question or two? Is that cool? No one else seems to have jumped in. So yeah, I know obviously one of our key points that Electric Kiwi raised was around that fact that you weren't going to use a benchmark or a bright line test and use the gentailers methodology. I think I've been through your reasoning and can understand that you don't want to get involved in how the gentailers build up that cost, but we still believe that a benchmark, even if it's just what the Electricity Authority uses to compare how gentailers have come up with their number, is actually really useful, because it's useful from a materiality basis. So you might go, oh, that's great from a bottom-up perspective, I can see how retailer one has come up with this number, but you don't know, but assessing whether that's reasonable or not, you probably need something in the background, and there are some methodologies, from Australia and stuff you could probably use just to form a sort of an understanding of range potentially that might come in. I still think it's valuable having an independent calculated number that gives a sort of bellwether of what they've done. So, and that could be transparently provided as well to the market. So yeah, that would just be my recommendation around that area.
Thank you. Understood.
Yeah, cool. And then the other area I just wanted to dig into, you talk about the smoothing, price smoothing, and the acceptability or not acceptability of price smoothing. And I noticed in the paper, I'm going to get into the weeds, 3.65C, you said we do not agree that smoothing is necessarily dealt with or linked to the approach to cost of electricity that the gentailer takes. Just wondering if you could shed a bit more light on that comment and what you were referring to.
I guess it's the difference between the process of setting one's retail prices for the period ahead, and an approach one takes to try and manage the spot price risk of supplying customers in the future. So they're not necessarily linked precisely. One doesn't depend on the other. You could not hedge at all and still provide smoothing to your retail customers, for example. Whether that's wise is another matter, but conceptually that's possible. So that was the only point there that we were trying to make.
Yeah, because I think the point maybe I made it on the day when we had the session last year, that a book build approach to the hedging kind of has that that smoothing impact in itself. So did you need to add the ability for them for people to price smooth on the pricing side as well? That was our point.
I can see how that can assist, and so for sure.
And then one other question around the segmentation. Am I reading it correctly that you're not intending to split small and medium out from residential?
Sorry, small and medium what?
Businesses out from residential, because they're both counted as mass market. Are you intending that if you did a regional analysis, it would be SME plus resi in that assessment of that region, or would you split out those two segments?
Currently, the proposal is that at least for disclosures, we would seek those as one bucket as opposed to split out. But again, and that's on our assessment of balance between detail and transparency and the cost of doing all that. If there are and the extent of competitive risk and so forth, all those kind of criteria that we set out in the paper. If there are reasons that you think that assessment fell on the wrong side of that balance, then we're keen to hear that, and that will support us in developing a final draft paper. And of course, again, this will be a first go around, so there'll be a lot of learning, and that again will help us in future to determine whether it's worthwhile to do more segmentation or to group it up further, or whatever the case may be, to ensure it's effective as well as cost effective.
Right, thank you. Those were my questions for now.
Question there from Huria. I think, sorry, Huria, we just need to enable your microphone and your camera. So if you bear with us for a minute, I think you should be able to talk now. If you unmute yourself.
I've done it at my end, so hopefully that will work for you.
But this isn't the same problem as Eleanor had. Oh, who says she can't? So they can't unmute themselves. So,
but perhaps could you put your question in the comment, please? We can see it here and answer that way, if that's okay.
Hui is just typing her comment in now.
okay, cool. Okay, here's the question. How do you determine unsatisfactory explanations in A5 if you avoid the need to develop and quantify models of what a reasonably efficient operator might do in A13?
Yes, so that's those are whether explanations, whether the methodologies and explanations provided with the RPCA stack up. So we may be able to see that from the explanations and whether they logically make sense, whether the data that sits with it stacks up with other indicators that we have of market performance and so forth, and whether any follow-up questions that we have on things that we may not understand first time around, whether they are satisfactory and meet that kind of like objectively justifiable type test, for example. So inevitably there will be judgment in that, but that's what we're here for.
Feel free to follow up with any more questions in the chat. I think we've unfortunately had the limit of our technical abilities to figure out how to unmute your microphone, but please follow up if you do have any other questions or any comments on that.
She may seek to rejoin.
I think my main lesson from this is we should just do it as a normal Teams meeting, because it's not like we're broadcasting to thousands of people. So that would be.
And everyone's well behaved and don't have the crazy drunk relative.
Okay, just give me a second and I will unblock you here. So you should be okay.
Oh,
Yes, I think that worked.
awesome.
Right.
Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess you kind of go on to say that it feels like a missed opportunity to effectively say, well, we're not going to determine a benchmark like we would, and as we pointed out in our submissions, that as we would do in other jurisdictions, but simply just try to determine whether the offers are, as equivalent or as efficient as what, we're as efficient as what you'd be offering independents. So at what point, I'm still kind of confused as to the point around, well, how do you explain that away effectively? Because that's kind of what it feels like the whole thing is geared to, is that there's these kind of broad tests, but effectively there's an allowance for explaining away that we just don't have any visibility against. So it's difficult for us to submit on these explain away factors when we don't know what you guys would assume is something that you can explain away versus what you can't explain away. And so that's kind of really where I'm trying to head with my questioning.
Yeah, understand that. So first comment I make is that the models that you refer to that used overseas in terms of what a reasonably efficient operator might do are really focused on setting retail prices for particular segments. This is certainly the approach in Victoria and so forth. That doesn't mean that approach isn't useful, but it is, it's not the same as the approach we're taking at the moment to the retail price consistency assessment. We're also very keen as an authority to get some transparency soon, and concerned that if we're going down the route of trying to specify models of what a reasonably efficient operator might do and what it looks like, gets us down into a protracted process of designing what is and what isn't, and how you might hedge efficiently, and how you might attribute costs and so forth. That may well end up be the right thing to do over time if we learn that the current approach that we're proposing doesn't work. But it's sort of like, at the moment, the balance is on getting transparency soon and trying this as efficient operator type approach that provides for variety and flexibility in developing an assessment.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I understand what you're getting at, but
Yeah.
The paper tries to strike a balance and doesn't end up on that side of the ledger at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I kind of won't push the point, but I think, when you look at the Victorian or AER or UK, whether it's a price cap or a default market offer, that's because of the assumptions that are used to calculate that benchmark, and they are those assumptions used are based on that being a cap or being a high watermark, if you like. Now, the difference, it's not for us, it's not about whether you're setting, you're establishing what a reasonable retail price is. It's actually the transparency of those methodologies that it is very, very clear what the input assumptions used to calculate what that so-called maximum price should be. And so whether it's an average price that you're saying, hey, is this sufficient, or a maximum price, or whether you can calculate, hey, is this prolonged negative margins, is that reasonable? You can test that against those assumptions and make that really transparent. And I guess that's what we're lacking in some of this, is just the transparency. And I appreciate the want, because you want to move fast, and we, support at least getting started, but I'm just saying, like, with that lack of transparency, it makes it hard to enforce, right? Because you haven't said on the outset what good looks like. So for me, it's more of a warning that it will be hard to enforce when you haven't said what good looks like.
Yeah, understand your point. Thank you for that. The only thing I would add to that is that in addition to the results, we're also asking for disclosure of methods and so forth. So there will be transparency around that also, although it's not going to be one method, it's going to be in essence 4 methods, and understand what that may not be as clean as a prescribed method, but it's about balancing different considerations. But understand your point, and again, it's part of we see this part of the learning process going forward as well.
Yeah, thanks. No further questions. Thank you.
Yes.
Right, can we switch to Angela Parker then, please?
Hi, testing, you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yep. Thank you. Apologies, I did miss the first 15 minutes, so I hope that what I'm going to ask has not been covered in those 15 minutes, but it might have been. Please tell me if it has been. I just wanted to go back to some of the comments that we made in our previous submissions that I'm not quite sure have been addressed. So obviously the primary concern for our energy system is getting firming investment with clear and proportionate regulatory settings. And I think that's where the authority has got some ability to kind of firm up, the confidence to invest. And without, I would say it's thermal firming that we need. It's not just more renewables. We don't just want more generation. We need firming for those renewables. I don't see anything that's forthcoming from the authority that is going to help with that. And yet it's, I think, the biggest hurdle that we have in our system. And I think we also need to have a really strong evidence base about the hedging competition. So one of the things was a lot of feedback on the last consultation, wanting a stronger evidence base about that hedging competition. And given this is kind of a competition issue, what difference has this latest consultation made to that environment? And then I guess lastly, we just want to avoid costly and market distorting regulations. I think some of that information that we're trying to gather from this consultation may be hindered just because it's actually asking for information that is actually competitive information. So how are you thinking about getting around that, given pricing is based on almost like withholding information and priced on scarcity and things like that? So just wondering how you're thinking about it, really.
I think to your first kind of general point, this intervention is not intended to drive the creation of more firming generation. provided it's designed to improve transparency and availability of hedges that provide access to that. If it, and I'm sure there will be views on this, but it's also not intended to distort price signals around that as well. So we're not saying, we're not claiming that this fixes thermal generation in and of itself or is intended to. So that's kind of the first contention.
Can I just jump in there? Why is that not the aim or the objective?
I think it's not the objective of the intervention in and of itself, because providing transparency around how you're selling hedges doesn't necessarily create the investment in the underlying generation. It should help support price signals, and it should help support access for third parties for those products, but it's not something that drives the investment alone, right?
And it goes to your second question. So there's other work programs that deal with those type of issues. It goes to your second question about greater transparency around the hedge market competition and so forth. And so again, different work program, but in recent times there's been an increase in disclosure of over-the-counter contracts, additional monitoring that's available on I think a monthly basis on what's happening in that market. So there's other things happening. These are not necessarily addressed within this particular piece of the work program.
Thank you. I guess just understanding that these will have a material impact on the investment in additional generation and firming. So it's not completely isolated from that part of the market. Just because it's not trying to address it doesn't mean it won't impact it.
And your contention is that that will be a negative impact, or is that am I understanding that correctly?
Well, it's creating additional costs, uncertainty costs, and other kinds of costs as well. And I think that will have a chilling effect on new generation and investment in firming, which is exactly what the electricity market needs in order to achieve its bigger overarching objectives. So I don't think it's wise to be going after a narrow objective set when you've actually got really big picture objectives to achieve as an electricity system.
Yeah, I think those are all reasonable points to be making. We have to, once we get to the end of this and we have what we've got in front of us, we need to go to the board for final decisions on this, and we need to think about how it fits in with the other work. So, we appreciate hearing those points.
Do we need to move to uncommitted capacity?
Yeah, any last questions on RPCA? Take that as a no. So you recall from our discussion at the workshop, I think we're all there. Said we're going to do some more thinking on feedback we got on uncommitted capacity. We thought it worthwhile proposing a couple of options, which we've outlined in the paper. One is essentially to take feedback from parties, sort of tighten up what the definition looks like, reflect that it is intended to be more about underlying capacity, that it is a point in time assessment, and provide greater clarity around the sort of customer base that you might account for as a gentailer when you're thinking about that. we also thought about another option, which is intended to kind of reflect some of the feedback that that ability to offer hedges is much more of a real-time issue, and that there's an ongoing assumption that as participants in the market for these hedges, gentailers will be offering contracts consistent with market making requirements and consistent with what's agreed under the OTC code. And so I was trying to sort of take that assumption, say that contracts should be offered, and then there's some guidance on what an objectively justifiable reason might be for not being able to meet requests. So I'll just kind of leave it at that and see if there are any questions around that.
Rob again, with the uncommitted capacity proposal, that was proposed that it be included in the code, but with your alternative option of intolerable risk, the intolerable risk provisions were going to be put into the voluntary guideline. And so I just wanted to understand why you thought the uncommitted capacity would belong in the code, but the intolerable risk, if you go for that approach, would better belong in voluntary guidelines?
I think that's a reasonable point to feedback on. I think we're kind of open to thoughts on that. I think I'm just trying to remember the kind of initial thinking on that, but it was essentially to keep the code requirements reasonably clear, but being able to map out our expectation in the guidance. But again, welcome thoughts from you all on that.
Okay, and another question I have is, if you decide not to go down the uncommitted capacity route, so you either just leave that out completely, or you have the intolerable risk provision added into the code or into the guideline.
Yep.
What's to stop me as a incumbent gentailer going, I'm going to interpret objectively reasonable or intolerable risk as meaning that I should only, my non-discrimination policy should only include offering uncommitted capacity?
I think we would want to. So this goes a little bit to the next proposal, which is we've said we want to see a little bit more. We wanted to specify a bit more what we would see in the non-discrimination policies. We'd want to see how that's mapped out in the policies, and we would want clarity on how that applies. So you know, if you're looking at that and you think there's just a sort of a massive kind of a loophole in that, then we'd welcome feedback. I guess it's not starting with an assumption of kind of gaming of this. It's starting with an assumption that gentailers do offer these contracts, that they need to do it in compliance with the principles. Their directors need to sign off, comfort that the way they're giving effect to this is aligned to the principles. So for me, that doesn't mean they would necessarily be comfortable taking the sort of the most extreme kind of approach, but again, really open to feedback on that.
Okay, but so are you saying that the uncommitted capacity approach would be the most extreme approach to non-discrimination? Am I interpreting correctly?
No, I was making a more sort of general point that we've set out what we expect to see in the obligation itself. What we would expect to see is policies that give effect to that. What's being proposed with the second option was that there's a presumption that that gentailers will be pricing up RFPs and, to the extent they can, providing these contracts. And where they're saying, I'm not going to price up contract A because it would put me in an intolerable risk position. The flip side of that is that they wouldn't be able to provide the same kind of thing to anyone else or to themselves under that implementation.
They would be, because it's a voluntary guideline.
Again, I think that's a useful thing to submit on, and I'd encourage you to do that.
And just to clarify, I wasn't in any way suggesting that what I described the gentailer doing would be something that would come under the category of gaming. It was more just that because you've got these two concepts that are quite broad of objectively reasonable and intolerable risk that aren't defined, that means that there's potentially a wide range of interpretations to that. So a gentailer an incumbent gentailer could genuinely think, hey, I just read the 2025 EA consultation paper, which explained why the uncommitted capacity approach was a really good idea. So I'm going to adopt that for the reasons the EA explained in its paper.
In order to meet that requirement. Yeah.
Versus coming up with something else which the EA hasn't commented on. So not quite sure whether the EA would like me doing that or not. So, but I've seen the EA say positive things about the uncommitted capacity approach. So I'll treat that as a safe harbour.
Yeah. I guess what would surprise me in that is that a lot of the feedback is from gentailers that was a very, very difficult thing to do. But again, if you think that there are gaps and a lack of clarity that we can address, open to suggestions on this.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Okay, thanks. In 4.42, you talk about the authority expects that that when a request is being impacted by an intolerable risk position, that will mean that they refuse to supply their internal business units, except where those contracts are required for the purposes of meeting existing commitments. I think there's a little bit of I guess a philosophical question here about when you meet your intolerable risk position, because and it comes down to the uncommitted, it does relate to uncommitted capacity, because if you're saying, well, no, to sell one more unit would put me in an intolerable risk position based on meeting my existing commitments to my internal business unit, then doesn't that kind of take you back to the same place as uncommitted, as we, many submitters raised on uncommitted capacity, is that there could actually be no uncommitted capacity if I'm to say, well, my existing commitments are to my internal business unit, and therefore one more, kilowatt hour is going to put me in an intolerable risk position.
Well, I think they're sort of conceptually two sides of the same coin, right? So to some extent, that's right. I think what both were intended to do, or are intended to do, in the draft is to provide transparency around that, because I think some of this feedback is it's not clear. It's not clear when it's a capacity, sort of physical capacity to meet contracts. Why a gentailer might not be willing to sell versus a kind of a range of other things that might be opaque to buyers, and so the intent is that it provides more transparency around that.
Yeah, and I think I kind of this whole, I feel like I understand where this is going, but ultimately what we've talked about with the RPCA and now with this is that effectively as of the 1st of July, this code is not, it's enforceable in terms of the reporting and the monitoring, but it's not enforceable in terms of the conduct, because there's no guideline, or there's nothing been established to say this is good or bad, right? Like, so it's like, yes, you must do all these things, you must report all these things, but you can, if you report that this is an intolerable risk position, you report that this is a satisfactory explanation, then over time that's actually going to need to be tested by yourselves as the authority, and some, like, you know, cases established to say what is satisfactory and not, what is intolerable and not. And so it feels like it's actually going to take quite a long time to build up to a position whereby the code is enforceable. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I just feel like at the outset, I don't believe that in the first reporting period that there's any possibility that you could enforce, because it's still too grey. It just, yeah, I'm just really interested in what your thoughts are about how you might make an impact in the early period of having this code in place.
I think what's incumbent on the authority, if it were to put these in place, is to map out really clearly what the sort of the compliance and monitoring elements of it are and how they fit together, because there'll be some things that that are in the code that might be quite easy kind of compliance yes or no type things. There will be some things that might fit into that space that you were trying to describe, which is, or we're describing, sorry, which is requires judgment, and judgment builds with transparency and information over time. And then there are some things that we would be looking at from a monitoring point of view, and that might help as kind of cross checks or further information. So I agree with the contention. I think that, and as JP said, this is some stuff that we will learn about over time. I think we need to be really clear on the code things that are kind of black and white breaches from the start. I think mapping that out is a useful thing to do, and it needs to fit well with monitoring and sort of the existing suite of work that we do in that space.
Great. Thank you.
I think I've done my 20-second pause or whatever it was for further questions. I think, you know, sort of really relevant to that point was we did think it was useful to provide more specificity on what we would expect to see in the non-discrimination policies that gentailers are required to produce. So we've proposed some code changes to give effect to that, and we welcome feedback on those. because if you sort of look a bit at how this regime hangs together, those policies or that policy is a kind of a cornerstone of how this all fits together. And it does allow, under that construct, the authority to look at those and make judgments about whether they are suitable. The other part as well was the requirement around the provision of audit reports. We're working on the assumption that audits will be done anyway to give the board's comfort around compliance, and so, but we thought it was useful to specify that. So thought I'd raise that there and see if there are any questions on those comments. Hi, Sam.
Hi, just a quick one around the audit regime. I see you're planning to use the existing audit provisions under the code. Is there an intention at this stage whether the authority itself would be running those audits, or would you approve a list of auditors?
I actually think we're quite open to feedback on that, because I think that the other way you could look at it is that you would do these audits with your own firm chosen auditors as part of an existing suite of auditors. So I'm assuming there's, you've got your normal financials, you'll presumably have climate related disclosure kind of based audits, whatever the other ones that you need to do. So we'd welcome thoughts on that.
Thanks.
Again, from my perspective, at least, not dogmatic about that. It's the ability to have transparency that and being able to see that piece of work.
It's unlikely that EA staff will be doing audits. I think that's very low on the probability list.
Correct.
But there is precedent with the Commerce Commission and under both Part 4 Commerce Act and Part 6 of the Telecommunications Act, where it requires independent audit of compliance, and the independent auditor has to be agreed to by with the Commerce Commission. So you could draw on that precedent.
That's how it's currently drafted, Rob. So the existing code provisions say the authority does the audit, or we can choose one from a list of approved auditors.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Again, welcome thoughts on that. Are there any other questions on the on issues kind of raised by this consultation?
One last question from me. With the intolerable risk, where did that concept come from? Is there some precedent that you drew on?
The wording and the concept more broadly comes from the OTC Code of Conduct. It does refer to a slightly different issue, and that is around the structure of a particular contract. But it is, the concept is drawn from that, trying to reflect the feedback that that was received through this process, which is this is what is available is all around risk management, and that is a dynamic thing. And so trying not to get in the way of that process, but to provide transparency around that process when it is being relied upon. Well, one more thing I thought, surprised no one's asked, but I'll volunteer it anyway. We appreciate that because we've done this round of consultation, that kind of timeline has moved a little bit. We thought on balance it was the right thing to do because in particular, we wanted further views on the uncommitted capacity work. We are giving thought to what that means for the sort of suite of things that were mapped out around implementation. Again, no, there are no decisions on this, but some of the wording in there reflects kind of how we were potentially thinking about that, and some of the submissions we'd received around kind of timing with annual reporting and auditing that goes with that. So we are giving thought to that as we go. I should be clear on that though, that that does not include any thought being given at this point on the implementation date itself of 1 July. Right, so that's done my pause again. Last call for questions, otherwise we will call it there. Thanks for joining. Really, and thank you in anticipation of submissions. What we would really love to see is where you are seeing room for improvement, please provide us drafting that might be useful, and supporting rationale that really helps our decision-making process. And thanks for your engagement on this.
Thanks very much.
Cool. Thanks all.